Hey you guys, welcome back. So I have had a lot of requests for a soil video, and this may come as a surprise, but I actually don't use soil all the time. So behind me here is my soil box that I keep here in the apartment, and I keep this full of my chunky mix. Now, my mixture for the plants that I keep inside of the greenhouse is actually a no soil mixture. So this bucket right here does not contain any actual dirt. So I've got my little baby Magnificum out here to help give us an example, but with some of these roots, basically what you're trying to do is create like the jungle floor for them. Think rainforest floor. It's everything that's fallen off of the trees, that's organic matter, biodegrading. It's humid, but it's not soggy. You're trying to allow a chunky enough mix for the roots to form and really easily move through it, while also not being soggy and bogged down. Because if you have a soil mixture that is heavy and retains water and just sits on your roots very dense and wet, it's going to cause rot. It's going to be difficult for those roots to actually grow into it, and it's not the best mix for your soil. So I actually saw an interesting post on Instagram today from Here But Not on Instagram, and he's actually also a Canadian, and his post was about overwatering. And what his post basically said is that overwatering is not a thing if you are using the proper soil mix. Because if you think about it, that rainforest floor, it's constantly so humid there. It's almost like there's like a fog of humidity that sits in the rainforest. Yet those plants don't just rot up and die. Everything is incredibly lush and healthy. And he compared it on his post to a bog. So in that bog setting, it's a different growing medium. So you've got more peats, mosses, heavy soils, and that doesn't promote great growth. With your plants, you always want to try to mimic how they would truthfully grow in the environment that they're from. So a common example, a Monstera deliciosa. In the wild, they'll even grow on trees. So you can imagine where those roots are at. They're not sitting in heavy, wet soil all the time. They're like fully exposed. They're on bark of trees, and the soil that they're in isn't going to be a heavy, wet, soggy mix. It's going to be kind of that chunky rainforest floor. So that is what we are aiming to recreate. So the most basic soil mix, I will tell you right now, if you don't want to do anything fancy and you just want to have a plant, need to repot that plant, and don't want it to perish on you, just make sure that you are cutting your soil with a lot of perlite. I'll even go like 40% perlite. That perlite will at least give you some aeration to the soil and allow it to drain more easily. So that is the bare minimum. I would never just use tropical soil out of the bag. I'm always cutting at the very, very minimum with perlite. So that's your lazy man mix. Now, if you want to go fancy like this, there's certainly more steps involved. So I will go into what I personally use when I am making my no soil mix. And this mix is perfect for inside the greenhouse straight as it is. However, if I am potting up a plant in my living room where the humidity is Canadian and lower, I'll cut this mix with soil. So I'll just mix like 1-to-1 soil to my nice chunky mix, and that's what I'll use in my normal low humidity living room. Okay, and one last thing before we dive into it. There is no magical cocktail for this. It's not going to be 2 parts cocoa to 1 part bark to 4 parts perlite. That's not how this works. It's actually also very dependent on who you are as a plant parent. So what I mean by that is if you are a lazy plant parent and you don't want to be constantly watering your plants, you may want to add soil or more cocoa or something to help retain that moisture longer, versus me, an overbearing helicopter plant parent. I like to have a very, very chunky, well-draining, very aerated mix. So all these little parts and pieces to the mix, you mix in what you think you will need based on who you are. And this is kind of a trial and error thing. Mix some, try it out. If you hate it, dump it back, remix in something else. You're going to want to kind of play with it a little bit and you will figure out what works the best for you. So with all that being said, let's dive into the no soil growing medium. So I'm not going to lie, I filmed this earlier and my microphone cut out. So my bags are all empty and that's why this is already mixed. So I'm just going to show you the empty bags while we talk about it. So part one, and a part that I really like, is bark chips. So this is a fine bark chip, but you can also get a chunkier bark chip. It really depends what you're planting. If I am planting a large monstera, a big bark chip is great. But a big bark chip wouldn't even really fit in this pot. So fine bark works better for something small. So I mostly sell plants that are like in 4-inch pots. So I'm constantly using smaller bark chips. So if we just think about bark chips, it's chunky. Air can actually get through it. It's organic. It'll break down over time. I find that those bark chips just provide the perfect kind of chunky mix and they hold water lightly. Like, think about soaking a piece of wood. It'll hold moisture, but it won't be soggy. So in between these bark chips, air can very easily pass through, but those bark chips are not going to be soggy against your roots. So I personally always use a ton of bark chip. And another additive that I use a ton of is perlite, specifically where I can find it, large chunk perlite. And usually I have small bags for this because I intended to show you guys in the video, but like I said, the mic cut out. So typically I would be buying all of these in big giant bulk bag sizes because I have a 50-liter tub here and I make use of it. So I prefer large perlite. So a lot of the perlite that you buy in big bags at those box stores, I feel like there's so much powder in it. Like, it's so fine that it's almost just powder. So I like these big chunks. You can actually see just how large those chunks are. That's my preference. In my mind, they're large. They have that nice chunky look to them. And if they're big, then they provide even more space around them to allow for more air movement. I prefer large perlite when I can find it. And perlite is one of those very standard things. Like, you can find it anywhere, it's not expensive, and it just adds that aeration to the soil that is so important. So, perlite has to go in the tub. Now, the next thing that I add is actually for water retention. So in the same way that sphagnum moss holds a lot of moisture, but holds it really wet and soggy, coco chunks also do the same thing, but without that like sogginess to them. Okay, I rooted around in the mix to try and find some, but coco coir, it basically holds that moisture, but as you can imagine, it's not like sphagnum moss. It's like much airier. So while it does hold moisture to help those roots out, it's not soggy. So that coco, I always add that into my mix as well. Not as much as the bark chips and the perlite, but just enough to help hold some moisture, because you also don't want your mix drying out like immediately. A dry medium around your roots is also not a good thing. So this helps me in between those waterings. Now, another one that I really like to use is worm castings. So worm castings, they kind of have like the texture and heaviness of a soil. So worm castings are essentially a gentle fertilizer for your soil. So it's all natural, it's not gonna burn your roots or anything, so you can safely add it into your mix. You can also top dress with worm castings. So I always have some worm castings around, and that I just dump pretty liberally into my mix also, just so that it has some of that good, organic, healthy matter to help kickstart that plant. And the next additive is a activated charcoal made for planting. So charcoal helps with leaching. So every single time that you're watering your plant, the water is going through your mix and it is stripping out nutrients. So charcoal will help slow that leaching down. It can also help prevent fungus and root rot. And it's very, very light. It's got that really bubbly, lightweight texture that helps keep your soil mix light and also provides aeration. Before you use that, do give it a rinse off because it's usually pretty dusty. Another one that's optional that I don't have here is lava rocks. If I'm feeling fancy. I'll toss lava rocks in. Same thing, it's just to help add aeration to your mix. Definitely not a requirement, a nice to have. What I've also been adding recently, and LECA lovers are gonna dislike me for this, but I tried LECA, I'm not a big fan, so I have been slowly adding LECA balls into my mixtures just to help me get rid of some of the LECA that I had around. And it's same thing, it's just another chunky thing to add to the mix to keep it light, keep it airy. It does hold a little bit of gentle moisture, so it's safe to have in there. So if you also experimented with LECA and didn't love it, feel free to toss it into your mixture. And that is kind of everything that I use in my no soil mix. Now, like I said, I will cut this with soil if I'm using it on my regular plants inside the apartment. Not inside the greenhouse, I do not use soil in there, but for plants that aren't living in 80% humidity, I definitely add an organic soil. Do keep in mind, organic soils typically come with fungus gnats, so usually when I'm doing repottings in the spring, I'm also watering in with mosquito dunks. Now, one final thing to discuss about these mixtures is that they do start to decompose. They are all organic matter. So if you're thinking about those little fir bark chips and all that stuff, it does start to break down and get heavier over time. So you're going to want to be trying to repot your plants probably at least every 18 months to 2 years minimum, just to give them a brand new lease on their mix, because you'll start to notice the odd plant that you've never changed up its care, but suddenly a couple years in, it starts to look sadder than usual and you're not sure why. It's probably because that soil is well leached out, heavy, compacted, needs to be changed. And that is kind of all that I have for you with regards to my chunky no soil mix. I guess the only final thing is that I do suggest pre-mixing it like this. So I just always keep a big tub of pre-mixed stuff and a little scooper in order to put everything into the pots. And that is super convenient because if you're going to do like a little repotting and you're trying to like put a little dash of each thing in, it's such a pain in the butt. This is so much easier. Just pre-mix it and store it away somewhere where you don't have to stare at it all the time. So if you have any other questions about this, definitely leave them down below. Same thing, if there's any other videos that you'd like to see, definitely suggest those topics. If this is content that you like, then subscribe to this channel. I'm trying to put out 2 videos a week. Haven't come up with a schedule yet, but I am working on it. And I will end this one here. So thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, you guys.